So start off with just a quick definition of grief. It's a feeling of loss. Not all grief has to do with the death. Some grief is a different kind of loss, and there's also some different types of grief. I listed a couple here. Anticipatory grief is when you're not facing the loss yet, but there's one coming or that could come. An example might be a family member or someone you care about maybe has gotten a diagnosis that's medical that is terminal or very severe. Delayed grief is a grief that is delayed in when it hits you or when you get the full symptoms or feelings of grief. So that might be you're so busy taking care of others when there was that loss that you don't feel it till later. Sometimes it's because we don't let ourselves feel the feelings. There's also grief with change, such as moving, our children growing up and moving out, our world's changing. Sometimes a friend that's no longer a friend anymore. Sometimes even a change in our body. So there's a lot of kinds of grief. This is kind of a long presentation, and almost every one of these slides could be their own presentation. So I hope that we cover everything you want. But again, if there's something you see that you have a question on, just let me know. So, how long does grief last? The truth is, it varies a lot and it never goes away completely. That would be extremely rare. Grief is not something you get over, it's something you go through. There's never going to be a day where you think back on, say, the loss of a loved one and go, that was fine. I could totally do that again. There will be a day where maybe it doesn't hurt the same way, or maybe you can go through the whole day without feeling that grief. Or maybe you're able to remember some of the more pleasant memories of the person you lost and not just that there's a loss. That is more realistic. But the idea of getting over grief, getting over loss is very unrealistic. And for most people, it is a lifelong companion. Like I said, it's not like you're going to wake up one day and go, wow, that was fine. I don't care anymore. That's just not going to happen. We don't feel grief or loss if it's not someone or something very precious and meaningful to us. And so we're never just going to feel okay with it. We're going to reach a point where it feels different or better. Usually it's going to evolve. Is some grief worse? I get this question a lot. And I also have a lot of folks that will say things like, well, they have it worse than me. Often things like, well, mine was quicker, theirs was slower, mine was someone closer to me. It doesn't really work to compare grief. Grief is grief. If it is a legit loss, something that hurts you, it's legitimate. If it's the worst you've ever experienced, it's the worst you ever experienced, even if someone else had a loss that you would consider worse for you. A lot of us are taught to not be selfish in that, well, there's people that have it worse than you, so don't whine, don't be sad, don't make us all feel uncomfortable. But that's not fair. There is no such thing as a selfish feeling. There are selfish actions, but you can't be selfish in having grief. It is a legit feeling, and comparing it to others does not work. So I have right here the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. You might have seen them before. They're pretty well known. I also have a lovely balloon giraffe. Some of my folks might be young enough that they remember Robot Chicken. And this is a reference to that particular skit. If you ever feel like looking it up, Robot Chicken Stages of Grief. It is hilarious. However, it's not work appropriate, so I'm not including it today, just a reference. So Kubler-Ross created these stages of grief, and a lot of us think of them as, oh, well, denial is first and acceptance is last. The truth is, these stages don't really happen in order. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance can happen in any order and at any time when we're going through grief. It actually was originally not created for the grief with the loss to a death. It was actually originally created with the stages of getting a terminal diagnosis of, say, cancer. And so denial is that stage where we're denying that this is not so bad, that this isn't happening, that maybe this is a mistake. Maybe this person didn't die. Maybe I don't have this diagnosis. Maybe I don't have to move. Maybe this friendship isn't ending. Anger is that stage of, I don't like this. I don't want this. I feel vulnerable. And so I'm expressing frustration, irritability, anger, maybe even hate. Bargaining is that stage where maybe we're trying to figure out, how can I get out of this? Maybe this isn't so bad. And, maybe if I do some good things, this bad thing won't happen to me. Maybe if I lose weight, this condition I'm dealing with will just go away. Maybe this is all a big mistake and I can figure out how to make it go away. It is very related to denial. Depression is that sadness, that feeling of loss. It is a big part of grief. It's what we most often associate with grief, is that depression. And acceptance is when we recognize, this is where I'm at. These emotions are okay. And this is what's truly happening. As I said, these don't necessarily happen in order. You can absolutely just have depression and never get anger or denial or bargaining at all. You can skip denial completely. You might start with anger and then go to denial. Acceptance is really that stage of healing. But as I said earlier, it's kind of a dance. You don't get over it. The stages don't just go away. We might go back to some of those stages we did before. So maybe we've been feeling okay about the loss of a loved one, but maybe for one reason or another today, I heard a song that reminded me of them, or maybe it's their anniversary or birthday with me, and I'm in that stage of depression. Or maybe I remembered something not so pleasant about them. I've gone to some anger. All of that is very much legit. And so I bring up these stages just as something to understand. Again, there's no rule about it. There's no order. This is just how most of us think of them. So with kids, and I'm talking younger children under the age of 10, grief is very challenging. Particularly our children under 8 have trouble with these concepts. Death is such a black and white concept for us adults. But children are still developing in their brains that idea of object permanence. So children will, for example, ask a lot of questions, sometimes the same question over and over again, like, well, are they coming back? Can I call them collect? Can grandma maybe visit me next month since I can't see her this month? These are very common questions in children. And they're not doing it because they don't understand or because we didn't explain it well. But for them, it does feel like the world changes at the drop of a hat. And so they're very much going to ask questions over and over again. This can also be true with things like divorce, moving, new additions to the family, such as a new baby. This can be very frightening for children. And they often ask questions like, well, is this new baby going to replace me? Is daddy moving out of our house mean I won't see daddy anymore? Does this mean you don't love me? These are very real questions for children, even though they're very uncomfortable for us adults. Children often act out. This is a way of them feeling in control. So we're often going to see some misbehavior when they're going through a lot of change or grief. They will sometimes act younger than they usually are. So they might tantrum when they're way too old for tantrums. They might cry more. They might want some more childish behaviors like night lights or to sleep with their adults. They also feel their emotions much more strongly than us adults. We're a little more trained in how we display our emotions, whereas children are not. The picture I have here is actually Elmo, for those of you that ever watched Sesame Street, and his dad. And they're talking about his Uncle Jack, who had passed away. And if you didn't know, Elmo's about 3-ish, 4-ish on the show. And so it's very typical for a 3-year-old to ask some of the questions that Elmo was asking in this particular episode. Things like, where's Jack gone? When am I going to see him again? I miss him. I don't want him to be gone. And his dad being very comforting and talking about how we can remember his Uncle Jack, what death really means. With kids, it is important to really use that more direct language. because euphemisms are an adult concept. So when I say someone's passed on, us adults know what that means. A child doesn't. I had a very sad situation several years ago where a grandmother had passed away, and someone had said to the child, very well meaning, well, it's just like sleeping. Unfortunately, that child, by the time they got to me, hadn't slept in a couple weeks because they were so afraid to go to sleep, because they were so afraid that they'd then go away. So it's very important to use very direct language and say things like, dead means they're not going to come back. Dead means I'm not going to see them tomorrow. No, you're not going to die tomorrow. Let's talk about that. And these, again, are very hard concepts for us adults, but children have these questions. And if we don't answer them, they are more frightened. These are just some tips. They do need a lot of patience. They will ask again and again and again, trying to get a different answer and make sure that we're sticking to the answer we're giving. Allow them to seek comfort, allow them to act out, and know that that grief's going to change. How you feel about a loss at age 5, you might feel differently when you're 10, or when you're 9, or when you're 15. You might feel that loss just as fresh 5 years down the road. As we said earlier, grief's not something you get over. Here we have Elmo and his friend Carly, and Carly's mom had to go into what us adults would call substance abuse treatment, what Carly knows as medical treatment for her mom. And she had to stay in foster care. A great episode for anyone that has a child going through that particular issue. Carly has to deal with her grief and her sadness and her worry about her mom. I think a lot of us forget that children worry so much about us adults. And so when we're not around, we need to make sure that they feel secure and have answers for what we're dealing with and when we're going to come back and who's going to take care of them. Teens are different than our kids. Usually we see teenage behavior anytime between 11-ish to 14-ish to start with. It does seem to get a little younger over the years, but teens are going to more likely seek their friends, like our friends here from Big Hero 6. They're less likely to go to their parent or adult. They're less likely to cry. They're more likely to be angry or withdrawal. They're also got their pride. And so they might not express their feelings openly because it feels so vulnerable, especially at school or with friends. They're more likely to also engage in distraction behaviors. This can include more time with their electronics or social media. It can also include drugs or alcohol. It can be disengaging from friends or family. And they are at higher risk for suicidal ideation, self-harm. Does this happen in all teens? Absolutely not. But it is important to watch for if you have a teen that's struggling. And it's not fair for us to assume they don't have these feelings. They also will identify more in grief. So it could be someone at their school they wasn't even close with, may have died or been lost in some way. When that happens, even though they're not close to that teen, they are more likely to relate. That's just part of that teenage experience of building that understanding of social behavior and friends. It's very important that we validate their feelings and not say, hey, you didn't even know them, it doesn't matter. It's very important to validate those feelings and be supportive. And I know teens can be hard. I really do. I work with a lot of teens here and have for many years. They sometimes can be a little hard to be around and hard to love, but they need support just like our small children. It just might be in a slightly different way. And as I said earlier, some of these could be their own presentation. So I apologize. I'm not getting into more depth on every one of these topics. If it's truly an interest of everybody's, and there's a slide here that really speaks to you, please shoot an email to me or Heather. We'd be happy to do another presentation on that topic. With older adults, now this again varies. Older adults can sometimes be your 50+ group. Sometimes they're really not until you get to your 70+ group. But older adults tend to experience more loss than other age groups, mostly because older adults are more likely to pass away from medical conditions. They're more likely to talk about death. This doesn't necessarily mean they're suicidal or wanting to die, but they're more likely to talk about when that time comes, the loss of their friends. They'll even say, I'm ready, I'm getting there. They also tend to be a little more nostalgic and struggle with change in our world. I can remember my grandfather, particularly to his dying day, hated the new card reader machines for his credit card. In fact, I recall him breaking one, and it was this huge frustration and loss for him. He felt like he was losing independence. He has gotten so used to purchasing things with his credit card, and now he couldn't just because he couldn't figure out a machine. It's really truly an experience that all of us could experience, and it's very, very hard. So it's one of those things we just have to think about with our older adults. They are more isolated, they tend to be more lonely, they tend to have less social support. Just like anyone else, they need patience, human connection, and validation for their feelings. It can be very frustrating when an adult just cycles over and over again with their feelings of grief, but that's where they are. Some adults, unfortunately, will reach the stage where they can't remember that someone's passed. I get the question a lot, do I tell grandpa that grandma's gone? Do I tell grandma that grandpa's gone? There isn't a rule. It's whatever is best for your loved one. If they truly need to believe that that person isn't gone and that's less distressing for them, that's okay. I know my grandfather, till his dying day, was convinced Nancy's in Mexico. Now, why he seemed to think my grandmother was in Mexico, I'm not sure. I know she used to travel to New Mexico when she was younger, but that was a lot easier for him than having to repeatedly explain that she'd passed. And it wasn't mean, it's not unhealthy. It was just what worked better for him to cause him less distress. Taboo grief. So these are various types of grief. Most you guys have probably heard of that we don't talk about very much and are a little harder to get support on because people feel uncomfortable. One that came up for me recently is missing persons. When someone's missing, we are grieving, but we don't know if they're dead or not. And that's a very upsetting feeling. And most people don't know how to support someone going through that. Generational trauma. We just had a major holiday where we talk about the impact of Native Americans and generational trauma. How do you respond to such things? Overdose or substance related loss, disability, people being disgraced or facing legal consequences. Someone goes to jail or just run out of town. We don't do that as much anymore, but it's a loss. And maybe even that's a loss in our trust in that person. Maybe it's I don't get to see them again because they're going to prison or they're facing an execution. That's still a loss. It's just a lot harder to find support or people you can talk to about it. Traumatic or gruesome deaths, another one that, again, how do we talk about that? And these are like all griefs, not griefs that just go away. I know miscarriage is one that people are getting better at it, but a lot of people have trouble talking about a miscarriage or loss of a child. We feel uncomfortable talking about these kind of losses, and so we often avoid them. So this is all meant in love, 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 but awkward humans. A lot of people at funerals or when we're talking to someone that's grieving, we're uncomfortable. We want to say the right thing, but we don't know what to say. If you've ever had to sign a sympathy card, you probably sat there just like me. I do it too. What do I say? And it's hard. And so sometimes we say something banal, maybe even hurtful. I've known many, many clients who've heard these exact things that I listed here and have told me just how much it hurt them, made them feel like they couldn't reach out. So this is not me dinging anyone in particular. This is really me saying, I have heard how much these things hurt. I include thoughts and prayers, even though I know a lot of us like to say, you're in my thoughts and prayers. Part of the reason that is getting a bad rap, especially in the last 5 years or so, is it's become a thing of you're grieving. Let me just say thoughts and prayers and hope that's enough. They're well meant. All of these are well meant. Sometimes we really are saying that was so long ago, aren't you over that? As in, feel better. I want you to feel better. These things still really, really hurt. And they can do real damage. I will honestly tell you, if you don't know what to say, you're better off being quiet than saying one of these things. Here's some things I do recommend saying instead. Saying, I'm so sorry you are hurting right now. Would you like comfort or advice? Truly asking what they would like. Asking how I can help out and really meaning it. If you don't mean to help, don't offer or be sad with them. Grief is not something to fix. It is a natural consequence of losing someone or something we love. Acting like it's something that needs to be fixed can be very, very hurtful. They're not broken. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. Now, for those of you that maybe are grieving and are encountering some of these folks that, again, mean very well, they do not mean to hurt. Some things I find helps is saying, I know you're trying to help, but I'm not in a place for advice right now. I could use some help with babysitting right now. I could really use a distraction. Could you tell me what's going on with your life? It'll make me feel so much better. I could really use help with some made meals. I know we're great about that in Utah. If you just brush them off, which I know is the instinct because we're hurting, we got enough to deal with. I don't want to have to help this person that's trying to help me. Get you. I totally get you. But if you just brush them off, they're more likely to continue to help in the way they think is helpful. So it really is better to give them something to do, even if it's something small. Even if it's a little thing like, could you just tell me about your kids right now? Could you recommend a good place for me to take my son to dinner tonight? He needs a distraction. He loves barbecue, and I don't know where to go. It's a little thing, but I gotta tell you, when we're standing there awkward, wanting to help someone that's grieving, it really helps us to feel like we're making a difference because we can't fix the grief, we can't fix the loss, but we want to help. There's literally in our body chemistry when there's a loss and we're seeing someone dealing with a loss, there is this rush of adrenaline of I want to fix, I want to help, I want to make this better. So don't be afraid to give them some way to make this better. I do have folks that ask me about not crying. There are billions of people in this world. There is no one way to grieve. Some people don't cry because they were raised to believe that crying is a weakness. Some aren't sad because of the loss, and that's okay too. Maybe it's because they suffered and that person really is glad they're no longer suffering. Sometimes it was a bad relationship, and so they're not actually missing or grieving that person. It is normal to not cry. It is okay. It does not mean you're broken. Certainly, you can always see a counselor if you need to. But not crying does not mean that you're not being normal. Guilt and anger go hand in hand with grief. Sometimes it's, I wish I'd been there more. I wish this could have been prevented, especially some of those taboo deaths that I talked about earlier, those taboo losses. It's something that's really good to work on in counseling, is that feeling of guilt. If we could just solve it in our own heads, we would. Sometimes we need to talk it out with somebody who isn't family, who isn't going to judge or tell us, well, this is just like with that ex-boyfriend when you were in high school, or, well, you always are like this. Again, well-meaning, not helpful. So it really is good to talk those things out. In truth, guilt is something that we have to personally decide whether we need to pick it up. And I'm not going to tell you whether you don't have a right to feel guilty. You might. But it often comes from a place of, I'm hurt. I don't like this loss. I want to change it. I want to undo it. And so working through it is a smart, healthy move. Same with anger. Sometimes the anger is just there because we're feeling pain. We're feeling loss. We don't want to feel powerless and vulnerable. We want to feel strong. Sometimes it's because we're angry that death is unfair. And it is. It is unfair. Fair. I would love that none of us ever had to experience loss, but that's just not how it works. You can't love someone or something, not feel that loss when it's no longer there, for whatever reason. These are great things to work on in counseling. Mourning. So, mourning is just the term we use for the rituals and behaviors that someone participates in when they're grieving. There's no wrong way. There's some ways that maybe are unhealthy, unsafe. Some of the things I mentioned earlier with our teens, drinking, increased use of social media or electronics to the point where you're ignoring your day-to-day life or people you care about. It can also be unhealthy to engage in self-harm, suicidal behaviors. It can be unhealthy to stay in a place of depression and not seek help. But there is no wrong way to mourn. And I will tell you that it's a very important part of humans and how we handle grief. Even folks without any religious tradition or family traditions around mourning can find a benefit in mourning rituals. That might mean all kinds of things to you that doesn't mean the same to someone else. But it's some of that adrenaline and using it up. It's feeling like I have some power and some ability to express what I'm feeling. It's expressing this loss publicly or privately in a way that I can tangibly sense. So these are very important to all humans, regardless of your cultural beliefs or religious beliefs, including a religious belief. Humor. I would bet that quite a few people here do not remember the Mary Tyler Moore Show. I hope a couple of you do. It is a classic. This is a reference to an episode about the death of Chuckles the Clown, where there's some lovely dark humor. And fortunately, Mary Tyler Moore there ends up laughing a lot in an embarrassing way at this funeral for this clown. Great episode if you ever want to watch it. But humor has a role in grief. It's okay to laugh. Some deaths are, in a dark way, funny. Some folks really do like having more playful or fun mourning rituals or funerals. And these are okay. These are part of what works for us. Part of the reason crying and laughter are so close to each other, they're both expressions of a strong, strong feeling. So it is okay to have humor. Now, it's also okay not to. And it's very important to recognize that someone might feel differently. So you might feel that a dark joke or some humor at a funeral is okay. Some folks might not. So always be aware that everyone's different, but a bit of humor really is okay. It's just different for different folks. So I would suggest not laughing at a funeral if everyone else is not laughing. Generally, that is frowned upon. Some mourning rituals that we know about: attending funerals or memorial services, wakes, wearing certain clothing. In the US, it's often dark clothing. Some people like visiting memorial sites, carrying mementos. I know folks that love to do charity work in memory of a loved one, even if it's something like, I'm going to cover someone's meal at McDonald's because they loved McDonald's. Some like doing celebrations of life instead of having a funeral or memorial. Some like avoiding social situations for a while. Some like seeking more out. There isn't one way to mourn. And culturally, we know a lot of different types of mourning. I have a beautiful picture here of the Day of the Dead celebrations in Mexico, a beautiful tradition. There's lots of different ways people mourn that are cultural or religious. Native American cultures often have a tradition of cutting their hair short. So if you all had ever seen me or worked with me back in 2020 through 2021, you would have seen me with a bob. Half of my family is Lakota. That's a Native American tribe out of South Dakota. And so during those 2 years, I had 4 deaths in a row in my family. And because it is a tradition to cut our hair, I rocked a bob for about 2 years. My hair's now grown back down my back, but that was for me a sign of mourning. And it was very important for me to participate in that mourning ritual. There's some cultures in Greece that don't shave for up to 40 days. There's cultures where wearing white, such in Asia, where wearing white is what you wear when you're mourning, not black. Some have certain hairstyles. Some practice Shiva. in Jewish families, or have other mourning periods where you don't do certain things. Some have traditions in their culture of we don't cry, we don't have any emotion. Some actually have traditions of very loudly crying and screaming and wailing in public. And that's their tradition and very normal. Some people have traditions for how the body is cared for. Some don't allow cremation. Some have viewings. Some insist on flowers or tokens. Some insist none. There's no one way. And even within some cultures, there's a difference in the culture, how some families do it and some don't. So just something to keep in mind. And again, there's no wrong way. And truly, if this is a mourning ritual that speaks to you, even if it's not your culture, there's nothing wrong with learning about it and seeing if it's something that fits for you. So if you're mourning, what can you do to feel better? My advice as a therapist is let yourself feel your feelings. Don't sit there going, I shouldn't be sad. I should be over this. I shouldn't be angry. This can cause delayed grief in my experience. It also can cause you to be so focused on the loss you're experiencing that you can't remember the good stuff. I know folks that avoid remembering who they lost so much that they have trouble remembering what their voice sounded like, that they have trouble remembering what it's like to be with them and have a good time, what it's like to laugh with them, the funny stories. So avoiding those things is something I don't recommend. Have your feelings and don't give it a timeline. Do participate in mourning rituals. They truly are a human behavior that is comforting for a reason. Do connect with others. I know that when we're mourning, when we're sad, we're angry, we don't want to be around people quite often. I gotta tell you though, as a therapist, I know how healing it is, even if you don't talk. One of the things I hear a lot, well, I don't want to bring the whole party down. I don't want everyone to feel sad. I get that. I do. I've been there. I've had lots of grief. But I gotta tell you, even being around people helps. It helps us be alive and not be stuck in our heads. Even if you're going to a movie or a festival or a show, you're sharing a human experience with other people. You don't have to talk. In fact, in a movie, please don't talk. But I would say it really does help just being around people, even if you don't talk. Seek counseling if you don't feel like going to counseling, support groups, even if they're ones of your own friends and family. Taking care of your basic needs. Don't forget to eat, to sleep, to do the things that help your body feel okay. If you don't, depression is almost inevitable. Take that desire to do something, that adrenaline, that I want to fix this, and do something that feels meaningful to you. If doing something that is for animal charities because your loved one loved animals feels good and like you're doing something, do it. If you want to participate in the March of Dimes or in some of the cancer research or fundraisers, if it feels meaningful to you, then it's good medicine. It's just about what works for you and seeking it out. If you're not sure, don't be afraid to consult with someone truly. Now I have some resources here. I'm not gonna go over all of them. As Heather said, we're gonna send you a PDF of all these slides. These are just places and books and websites that I have used for the 15 years I've been in practice. I have been working grief since the very start of my career. And so this is something I'm very familiar with, and these are just ones I've used for a long time and are tried and true. And so by all means, when you have that PDF, feel free to look up any of these resources. If you're not sure about a resource, you guys do have my email, let me know. And just on the lighter side, just a few things that I recommend that I found helps. If you're going to a funeral, bring tissues. Yes, I know funeral homes provide them. Trust me, bring tissues. If you're going to a funeral and you are someone that relates to people, you're probably gonna cry. Bring more makeup and a makeup wipe. Turn off your cell phone. Nothing is louder and more embarrassing during a sobbing funeral than having your phone go off, and odds are it'll be some annoying, embarrassing song. I have a colleague, I won't name her because I'm sure she'd be embarrassed, who at a funeral had Another One Bites the Dust go off in the middle of the funeral. and she is still mortified about that to this day. Always check the wind when throwing ashes and close your mouth. And yes, I do have experience with this one. It's okay not to know what to say. It's okay to feel awkward. All funerals are awkward. You may see faces you haven't seen in a long time. And if you see someone you don't like at a funeral or a wake, please save that conflict for another day. A funeral is not the place. And I find that funeral potatoes are best at 350 with a bit of time under the broiler. So that is my presentation. I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so I can pull up any questions that you might have and respect everyone's privacy.
How do you deal with family members that don't understand that grief doesn't just go away in a week or a few months?
So one of the things I will say if someone says, I have a family member that should be over this by now, is I'll say, hey, are you ever going to be over your loss? Does it still bother you? Give them their space and time. And so I really do confront that. Now, sometimes you can tell someone till you're blue in the face, hey, this is how it is, and they just don't want to listen. Another approach to take that's a little more aggressive is to say, why does it matter to you? Why is it a big deal to you that I move past this? What's your concern? It's a way to make it about them instead of about you and your grief. Because again, there is no timeline. You may never feel you're at the point where you have moved forward, where you are healing. Now, my hope is that all of you would reach a point where you heal. What that looks like might vary, but no one gets to decide that for you. And so my approach would be either to continue to say what I've said already, that there is no timeline, and hey, I'm never going to be over this, neither will you. But it's also okay to put it back on them on why is this a big deal to you? What is your concern? Why is it so important to you that I move forward? I would even say that's true with when you have a loss with, say, a breakup or moving or that nostalgia I talked about earlier with older folks. I don't like the world's changed. You don't have to get over it. If that person won't back off, not your job to educate the biased, stupid, or unfeeling. And I don't know which category your person falls in, and I wouldn't dare judge and say which one they are. But it's not your job to make it easier for them. You're allowed to have your feelings, and you don't have to be nice about it. I think that's something that a lot of us do when we're saying move forward is don't make me uncomfortable. I want you to feel better so I don't feel uncomfortable, which isn't fair. We're allowed our feelings, and it doesn't matter if it makes someone else uncomfortable.
Okay. The next one said, would you mind briefly addressing survivor's guilt?
Uh, Survivor's guilt typically is a feeling of guilt that we have when someone has passed on, but we feel guilty for the circumstances or that we're still here. And that can vary a lot from person to person. Some of the worst ones I've seen have been people both in the same situation and one survived and one didn't. I will say it's something best worked on in counseling because it's such an individual experience. It is really important to work through those feelings of guilt and responsibility, and in counseling, what we call locus of control. What did I actually have control over? What did I not? A lot of folks struggle with survivor's guilt with feeling like I wish them harm or I wanted something bad to happen and now I feel bad. Or even wondering, did I wish something bad had happened? Did I do something to cause this? Again, it's so individual. It really is important to work it out with someone who knows what they're doing and is compassionate and willing to help you kind of sort out those thoughts. It is probably the hardest guilt I've ever known people to struggle with. It can happen to anybody at any age. I've even seen young children struggle with survivor's guilt. If you're looking for a book on the topic, I don't think it's included in my list of resources, but I highly recommend Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. It is a beautiful book. I have used it my entire career. It really talks about how you build meaning out of survivor's guilt specifically.
Okay, the next one was how can you help a family member who refuses to get help or truly grieve their loss?
Hmm. The truth is, you can't make someone do something. If I had the secret to that, believe you me, I'd be using it. But if someone does not want to grieve, they don't want to seek help, you can't make them. There is no trick that will make them all of a sudden change their mind. The best thing to do is to create a boundary. So, a boundary in the world of therapy is not a wall, it's a door. You can open and close as needed. It's just a verbalized expectation. So, my advice on a loved one like that is I know you're grieving. I know you're struggling. I really think you need help. And if they say, no, I don't need help, you don't know what you're talking about, well, it won't help, blah, 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 blah. Okay, you know how I feel about it. And kind of keeping that boundary. If you make yourself responsible for someone else's feelings, you will ultimately feel overwhelmed and like you're even failing at something. As a therapist, I can't make someone feel better if they don't want to. And so I think the most important thing for you is to recognize what you can and can't do and to encourage, but not make yourself responsible for getting them that help. That is a journey they have to make on their own. And there is no way to make them do it. Oh, so many messages of so many folks grieving. It's such a human experience that we all share.
I'm still blaming myself. My fiance was killed by gun violence. I find it hard to speak to his mother as a lot of blame was being pointed at me as I was the spouse. One week she empathizes with me and then I won't hear from her. We know the suspect that did this, yet his mother will call and ask me the same questions and she has been asking for over a year. How do I handle that?
Sounds like she's going through some of her own grief and it might be leaning a lot on you and taking it out on you. And I find that happens a lot with a traumatic loss like that. When we lose someone to gun violence or other kind of violence, there's a want for an explanation or for it to make sense. There's also a want for someone to blame. And it's usually not simple or cut and dry. And so often the people we take it out on are the people who are trying to help us or are kind to us. So I'm not entirely surprised that she's taking it out on you. I really would suggest putting some good boundaries on that. It's good that you are helping, but it's not good that she's lashing out at you. I would say our two webinars on setting boundaries with toxic people would give you some really good tips. I'm not in any way calling your mother-in-law or mother toxic in any way, just that's very toxic behavior. And so I would think boundaries would be the best response. And that might mean sometimes even hurting their feelings and saying, hey, I'm not responsible. You don't need to yell or be mean to me. I am not doing anything wrong. If you're going to continue to talk to me that way, I'm going to hang up the phone. I'm going to ask you to leave. I'm grieving too. That's not mean. That's not self centered. That is a boundary that you have a right to.
Okay. The next one is it normal to experience something like brain fog? I lost my grandpa who was also the father figure in my life a few weeks ago, and I can't remember things like normal, and I'm just not as on top of things like usual.
Yes, it is normal. Part of the trick with grief and normal is this is something every human goes through. So what's normal is very tricky. It's almost pretty much all normal. When we're grieving, because our bodies are responding to a loss, we get a traumatic response in our body. That doesn't mean trauma, but a traumatic response. And so what will happen is our amygdala will kick the fight or flight in to get us through that hard time because we're having trouble remembering things. We're having trouble getting going. We're having trouble with motivation. One of the side effects of high stress, high trauma, or fight or flight is brain fog. So, forgetfulness, even things you should know. I've known folks that will forget important things like birthdays and not have an explanation of why they forgot. It can also cause you to kind of have your thoughts move slower and have trouble organizing them. It can mess with your processing ability, your creativity, your problem solving ability to go, if this, then this. That can get affected. What I find works really well to help with that is one, making sure you're taking care of your basic needs so that your body feels safe. It also helps to do some really good breathing exercises to help your brain know we're not in danger. Give me back my thinking ability. It also helps to write things down more, even if you didn't need it before, just to help your body cope, because it's more strain to remember things when you're grieving or going through a major loss.
Okay, the next one is I'm still mourning a taboo loss when my daughter tried to commit suicide. She is still here, but it is not the same child personality wise, and I feel like my daughter is gone.
Going through a suicide attempt is very life changing in most times. And it takes a while to get back to that new normal. It really is tricky. I will say one of the most important things to do is to adjust that new normal, slow and steady, and know that it's not going to be like before, but it's going to reach a point where it feels normal. It can honestly take years. And part of it's going to be on your daughter, not just you. I find it does help to be involved in some of those suicide survivor groups, some of those support groups. I also find you can find some meaning in involving yourself with New Hope or the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Those are places that can give us a sense of purpose and meaning when we're still dealing with that major change. Because sometimes it helps to see what the other side looks like, to see what it looks like when someone has reached that healing, which maybe your daughter hasn't reached that stage of healing yet. And so you might still be in that process of loss instead of that process of healing, which is really painful and hard. I think take it day by day, make sure that you're refilling your tank, taking care of you, and slowly adjust this new normal with them. And it might also help to talk to them about this feels strained. Can we find a way to reconnect? Can we find a way to build some ritual, some normalcy for the two of us? It is a process and a tricky one.
The next one is my partner lost her best friend and she blames herself for not being there for her. How can I help her overcome this guilt she is feeling?
Well, you can't fix it for her. I wish you could. But one of the things I find helps is one, being a listener, not trying to fix it, kind of like we talked about earlier. And it does also help to say things like, you know, you never would intend them harm because you love them. You clearly love them. You do not need to borrow blame when no one is blaming you. You have to say it firmly and directly. And sometimes it has to be said by someone that's not a loved one. That is one of the benefits of a therapist, is because we're not family, we can sometimes say those things and they hold a different weight, not more weight, but a different weight. I'd also say be very supportive and say what a good friend they are to you, and saying how much you care about them and know they're not the kind of person that would ever intentionally cause harm. It also might just be comfort and time. And I wish I could give you the magic fix, but it might be they have something that they still have to process.
Next one is what resources would you recommend for helping me move through anger? My oldest sister was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and I have had to take responsibility for a lot of the healthcare. I'm finding
Mhm.
myself responding to my other family members' grief with anger because of the extra responsibilities I've had to take on top of my own grief.
Okay. Lot to unpack there. So, for starters, I would say if you have family coming to you with their grief, you do not have the capacity to take that on right now. And that's not you being selfish, it's not you not caring or recognizing where they're at. You're already taking on a lot, and there's only so much capacity we can give. And so I would say if they're feeling grief and they're trying to share it with you, you probably need to direct them to someone else and say, I hear you. I know you're hurting. So am I. I'm not in a place to hear that from you. I'm not in a place to help you with that. Don't be afraid to hand them the card of one of the places that can, including us or other places, and say, please talk to them. I love you, but I can't take this on right now. I would also say, think about how much energy and emotional energy you're having to put into with taking care of your sister. That's a lot of feelings you're probably going through that take a lot out of you. So make sure that you're compensating by taking care of yourself extra, by refilling your tank, by making sure that you're having a place for your emotions. I would also say anger, sometimes you have to express it. Now, of course, you can't express it at your family right now or at your sister. I get that. But have a place where you can. If you need to spend an hour breaking plates, do it. If you need to yell at somebody, pick someone that's safe to yell at, not a supervisor, not a child. Let yourself have that space to be angry. It's not fair that you and your family are going through this. And it's okay to be angry about that. But a lot of us are taught that anger is unhealthy or unsafe or wrong, particularly females, very much taught that. So giving yourself a space to be angry and not taking on more than you can take on would be my advice.